Hi folks, you're with Tacitus Today. Tacitus Today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the issue that the globalists are pushing quite hard at the moment, and pushing particularly hard in Britain, is that we must have mass migration, turbocharged, triple turbocharged, nuclear-powered mass migration. And why must we? I mean, this is not a debate. We must have this because of the declining birth rate. Now, there's no doubt the birth rate's declined. There's a lot of question marks over whether mass migration is any solution to it. But let's have a look at this because the amount of globalist misinformation, the globalists pushing misinformation and disinformation is pretty acute here. So we need to look at this. Now, I've just made a few notes, just quick notes, sort of. So let's look at the baby boom type years, because this is the baseline that the propagandists for the fraudulent propagandists for the globalists use. They're using this as the baseline and saying, well, the baby boom following World War II, that's the baseline. Anything less than that is a reduction in the birth rate, and it's a terrible thing, and only bringing illiterate peasants in from the third world can solve this birth rate decline. So let's I mean, it's absurd even on the face of it, but they're getting a free run in the British media, and the government people are parroting these lines, and the NGOs are parroting it. So there's an entire miasma of misinformation around this. So I just wanted to get the record straight, or more importantly, put some perspective on this. Now, the net births, there was 2 or 3 years when net births in Britain following the World War II, or 1949 and following there. This is when the population, by the way, was 50 million. And the net births, this is births over deaths, was about 380,000. But that was only 2 or 3 years where they were getting those sort of numbers. Those weren't the numbers all the time. Now, if you take the peaks and the troughs from that period, say 1940, or that baby boom, so-called baby boom period, 1947 to say at the time when abortion and contraception and divorce came in, because they all came in quite quickly and clustered together. Sort of in the late 60s. I think abortion in England was, I think it was legalized in 67, but it didn't sort of kick off into being a lifestyle choice till a few years after that. But anyway, let's have a look. Now, the death rate was quite high. People were dying. Not many people even made it to 70 back in the day. And I remember as a kid, in Australia, that you just didn't see many old people around. Men were dying at around 67, 68, and anybody, women at around 70. Anyone that made it into their 70s was because, oh wow. And there was a woman down the road who'd made it to be 80, and it was, there was an intake of breath around in the local area that someone could ever be that old, because it was so rare that people lived to that age. So people were dying much younger there. So the difference between births and deaths it was reflected, and I've got the numbers here, in a net birth rate. So say there were 1 million, for example, 1 million births, but there were 600,000 deaths, then the net birth rate is 400,000, or the net population increase, if you prefer. Now, at the same time as, and again, these things came in all pretty quickly: abortion, contraceptives, and easy divorce, or much easier divorce, all came in within the space of 5 years. And so this was a hammer blow to the birth rates, and the birth rates sort of declined. Now, nonetheless, the birth rate over the average birth rate at the time was, give or take, 200 or so thousand. Now, you could say it was 220. No, it wasn't. It was 219 and a half. All these sorts of things. But the net birth rate over deaths didn't really change that much because death rates declined quite considerably. After World War II, for example, well, a lot of people died in the war, but there were a lot of people who had injuries and they died as a result of those injuries. So the death rate started to decline quite sharply, and more or less, not perfectly, more or less tracked the decline in birth rates. The decline in birth rates, if you added up the amount of contraception, the abortions, and the amount of divorces, you put that together and you do a sort of a calculation based on that, then that was where the birth decline or the decline in birth rates came from. It wasn't that people stopped procreating or didn't copulate anymore or didn't necessarily get married. So now then the next level of hammer blows to declining birth rates was where the government openly encouraged women to join the workforce and to stay on to do senior high school. Now, even when I was a kid, and I'm like 62, when I was a kid, women or girls rather, very few of them really stayed on until senior high school. In the more well-to-do areas, the upper middle class, you would get them staying on because it was considered far too vulgar for the daughters of the well-to-do to go and become hairdressers or something like that. I mean, the vulgarity of it was just off the charts. So they would be encouraged to stay on and then do some sort of bullshit sociology course to university, then marry some man who was well-to-do, and that was their sort of path. But the governments were Western governments, again, in the beginning of what was the globalist project, were encouraging girls to stay on at high school, go to college, that sort of thing. And so that the peak procreation rate, I remember that girls were procreating at 16 when I was a kid. As long as they had parental permission, they could do that. I don't know if that's even legal anymore now. So that the main sort of procreation period, sort of 18 to 21, that certainly was around when I was younger, that was no longer, that was kicked, the can was kicked down the road, and girls were finishing university at 21, 22, and then they were looking at maybe a job in the public service or something like that. So they weren't procreating, if at all, until they were in their mid to late 20s. So that kicking the can down the road for peak procreation time, that also was a big shift in the social dynamics of things. But nonetheless, the average birth rate over that time was give or take 200,000, which it was after that time. So because of the decline in death, people living longer. So that created a different emphasis, or if you look at the hard numbers of the social structure, and that meant fewer babies being born, so that you have that time delay, 16 plus years or longer if kids are being encouraged to stay at school. You have that 16 plus years before these kids become workers and independent consumers in their own right. So there's that change in structure, and then you have older people. But then older people were, or in some cases, were working longer, and that was also a shift and a change. But equally, they were still retiring, and they were living, instead of living 2 to 3 to 5 years after retiring, they are now living 15 years after retiring. So that again created a very different dynamic of how do we pay for this and so on. Now, what would be the solution for that? Well, the solution that the globalists claim is, well, only mass migration can do it. Now, bringing illiterate peasants in from the third world, can anyone even in their wildest dreams assume that's a solution to anything? It's hard to believe that anyone could be that stupid, but it's the talking point they relentlessly push through the media and through the body politic, and again through the NGOs and so on. But there's some differences here worth looking at. When you have local people who are have long traditions in the country and they procreate, then if you've got people that speak English, being brought up with all your customs and I'm assuming Britain here, brought up with all the local customs and habits and education and school and so on, and then they know, they go into the local workforce, and so they're far more productive much earlier, and are not demanding special carve-outs and dispensations for their racial diaspora or anything like that. So they're far more productive and desirable citizens by far than anyone you could import, unless you import purely on the basis of skills. Which is not the case. Now, the globalists play a double game, and I look at this across all the talk shows and current affairs shows in Britain. They claim that the migrant intake is all skilled. No, it's not. What idiots! Less than 5% of the migrant intake are productive. And some are saying that even half that is being generous, but let's assume 5%. So out of the million people that are brought into the UK, only 50,000 are worth, as in economic, they've got the skills or the work experience, the knowledge. They have needed skills rather than skills that are in surplus, and those sorts of things. So 50,000 is it, and even that I would think is generous. But let's assume that's the case. So out of the million, only 50,000. Now that's pretty much common. The Australian government did a report on this a few years ago, and they came up with about the same numbers. And there was also some, I think it was in Florida, I could be wrong, but I think it was in Florida, the United States, where they looked at the migrant intake into Florida, and they came up with roughly the same numbers. So we can safely establish that at all the mass people movements going on and around the world, only 5% are productive and useful as in an social economic sense into the first world country they're going to. Now, in a first world country, the bar is pretty high. In a third world country, if you're upright and warm and can push a broom or can stand there all day with the goat herd, then that's good enough. But in the first world, it's quite different. What are your skills? What are your education? Are you literate? Can you speak the language? This and that. So by comparison, it's a relatively high bar. So what the globalists have done, they just lowered the bar. So it doesn't matter whether you speak English, and it doesn't matter whether you're illiterate in your own language. Who cares? We only want you to push a broom. So who gives a shit whether you speak the language or you've got any skills or not? But they're not economically productive. People in that category then create a sub-economy that is effectively a slave economy. Now, what first world country wants that? Well, none, I would think, but it's what the globalists do support. So coming back to this birth rate, the birth rate, as in the net birth rate, births over deaths, hasn't really changed that much, even from the baby boom years. Now, what's happened is the notion has been that, well, we can bring in all these third world peasants because they're needed, but they're not, and they never have been. They don't fit in. They demand special carve-outs. They want special electoral representation. They want special handouts, special freebies. They want special laws that apply only to them, and so on and so forth. So this is a disaster of the first order. If you look at the spread of births in the UK, you were looking at, there was a small cohort in the upper classes, but you had quite a large birth rate in the socially mobile, upper working class, middle class thing, and they were probably the biggest cohort of birth. Well, maybe not the biggest, but certainly one of the biggest. So if you look at, for example, 100 births in the UK, 40 of them, 40 to 45 births would have been in the upwardly mobile. So these people are going to be particularly productive and particularly loyal to their country and their fellow citizens, that sort of thing. Whereas once you replace them with, or outnumber them, which is more to the point here, with people that come from outside who are encouraged, indeed exhorted and extolled by the globalists to hate the West, hate Britain, hate white people and so on, and funded by US aid to do so, then that creates a very different dynamic, a very, very socially destructive dynamic. So do we want to increase birth rates? Well, maybe. Why not have a more efficient society where automation and AI and robotics create a far more efficient society of a smaller number of highly skilled people. Isn't that more desirable? I mean, maybe it is. I think it is. So this idea that mass birth rate or that mass migration has to replace mass birth rates, I don't agree with that. I think it's a flawed assumption, and I don't think it achieves anything other than social destruction. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.